If Khrushchev had misjudged the mettle of President Kennedy at Vienna, the Cuba crisis corrected his assessment. There was to be no further showdown between the two leaders, not even over the unsolved problem of Berlin and the German peace treaty. On the contrary, the Cuba crisis was followed by many hopeful portents. In December 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union signed an agreement on the peaceful exploration of outer space. More important, on the 5th of August 1963, a nuclear test ban treaty was signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. It marked, said President Kennedy, a step toward reason, a step away from war. Said Mr. Gromyko after the ceremony,
"The Soviet government considers it a success of the peaceful foreign policy of the Soviet Union, a success of all states advocating the aversion of the danger of a new war and the maintenance and consolidation of peace."
Perhaps one contributory factor to the signing of the test ban treaty was hinted at in a broadcast from Radio Moscow.
During the Caribbean crisis, when the world stood on the brink of a thermonuclear disaster, China's leaders tried to fan the flames by claiming that a compromise with the United States amounted to surrendering to imperialism and reaching a Munich deal at the expense of the Cuban nation. It is significant that any move to improve relations between the Soviet Union and the United States meets with strong objections from the Chinese leaders.
While the test ban treaty was subsequently signed by 99 nations, France and Communist China were not among them. But then, of course, Communist China, at least, was not a member of the United Nations. China had long posed a problem for America in Southeast Asia. It was one of the last with which President Kennedy concerned himself. He had already defined America's role in the Vietnam War at a press conference.
As you know, the United States for more than a decade has been assisting the government and people of Vietnam to maintain their independence. During the last 2 years, that war has increased, and we have increased our assistance there. And we are supplying logistic assistance, transportation assistance, training, and we have a number of Americans who are taking part in that effort. There's a long history of our effort to prevent Vietnam from falling under the control of the communists. That is what we are now attempting to do, and as the war has increased in scope, our assistance has increased as a result of the requests of the government.
Pressed as to whether American combat troops were involved in Vietnam, the President added this.
I think I've just indicated what our role is. We have increased our assistance to the government. It's logistics. We have not sent combat troops there, though the training missions that we have there have been instructed if they are fired upon to, would of course fire back to protect themselves, but we have not sent combat troops in the generally understood sense of the word, as I've indicated.
So matters stood during 1962 and 63, up to the time of the Vietnam Rising against the hated regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. To most observers, American and Vietnamese alike, the overthrow of Diem came as no great surprise.
It is no surprise to me because I have known for a long time that the population was very discontented against the government, and that was why over a year ago I already urged the President Ngo Dinh Diem to allow a complete change of the regime and of the government.
So said Tran Van Chon. His daughter, Diem's sister-in-law, the so-called Dragon Lady, happened to be touring America at the time of the military coup. She was not so restrained in her comments. Asked whether she felt that America was implicated in the rising.
Oh, definitely. In Vietnam, it is this. No coup can erupt without at least American incitement or American backing. You must know that.
And as an afterthought, Madame Nhu added for the record,
"No one can seriously believe in the claims that Americans have nothing to do with the present situation in Vietnam. Because of this, anything which would happen to my family would be an indelible stigma against the United States. Whatever is done against Vietnam will be felt in America too.
Whatever is done against Vietnam will be felt in America too. On November the 2nd, 1963, President Diem was shot in Saigon, together with Ngo Dinh Nhu, Madame Nhu's husband. It was one of the tragic coincidences of history that 3 weeks later, President Kennedy himself was shot by an assassin in Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy was succeeded by President Johnson, who 7 weeks later delivered his first State of the Union message to Congress.
Our ultimate goal is a world without war, a world made safe for diversity, in which all men, goods, and ideas can freely move across every border and every boundary. In 1964, we will be better prepared than ever before to defend the cause of freedom, whether it's threatened by outright aggression or by the infiltration practiced by those in Hanoi and Havana who ship arms and men across international borders to foment insurrection. And we must continue to use that strength as John Kennedy used it in the Cuban crisis and for the Test Ban Treaty, to demonstrate both the futility of nuclear war and the possibilities of lasting peace.
President Kennedy was succeeded by President Johnson. In Vietnam, the corrupt government of Ngo Dinh Diem was succeeded by the military government of General Han. The war against Hanoi and the Viet Cong was pursued more vigorously and more efficiently. Pressure against Havana continued as an economic boycott. The trouble was that the economic boycott seemed to be relatively ineffective. It certainly did not bring about the fall of the Castro regime. Should the boycott therefore be stepped up to the point where it became an economic blockade?
Exactly such a policy has been recommended by some of our more reckless politicians, but the preponderance of informed opinion is that a blockade against Soviet shipments of non-military supplies to Cuba would be extravagantly dangerous, carrying the strong possibility of a confrontation that could explode into nuclear war. I think that we must abandon the myth that Cuban communism is a transitory menace that is going to collapse or disappear in the immediate future and face up to two basic realities about Cuba. First, that the Castro regime is not on the verge of collapse and is not likely to be overthrown by any policies which we are now pursuing or can reasonably undertake. And second, that the continued existence of the Castro regime, though inimical to our interests and policies, is not an insuperable obstacle to the attainment of our objectives, unless we make it so by permitting it to poison our politics at home and to divert us from more important tasks in the hemisphere.
So said Senator William Fulbright of Arkansas on March the 25th, 1964. His speech happened to be delivered as part of a filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill. But it sounded a strangely new note in American international politics of the 1960s. For the speech amounted to a suggestion that the whole of America's Cold War strategy should somehow be rethought. Senator Fulbright urged the administration to, quote, cut loose from established myths. He urged it to recognize that communism had come to stay in China, and that the Soviet Union, quote again, though still a formidable adversary, has ceased to be totally and implacably hostile to the West. In this suggestion that the Cold War should be carefully rethought, Senator Fulbright found many American supporters. By 1965, the war in Vietnam had begun to escalate alarmingly. American combat troops had finally been committed to the fighting, and the first bombs had begun to fall on North Vietnamese territory. Asked whether such raids were likely to increase, Marshal Key replied for his own forces.
Yes, that is my intention, and I proposed it to the government many times that I think we must attack them daily, 24 hours around the clock, day and night.
Said President Johnson rather more reluctantly.
I wish it were possible to convince others with words of what we now find it necessary to say with guns and planes. We have no desire to see thousands die in battle, Asians or Americans. We will use our power with restraint and with all the wisdom that we can command. But we will use it.
Said Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon.
Unfortunately, we went in there joining with them from the beginning as so-called advisors, but we did the bombing, not the South Vietnamese. We even took South Vietnamese truck drivers and put them on a helicopter so we could say that there was a South Vietnamese in the helicopter as we dropped the napalm bombs on villages, killing innocent women and children, as well as, we hope, some Viet Cons. No, our record is a sordid and a sorry and a sad one in regard to our unilateral action. We are a complete outlaw in Southeast Asia. We've been an outlaw from the beginning, and so have the communists.
By the spring of 1965, opposition to the war in Vietnam had begun to escalate in America almost as fast as the war itself. On April the 17th, 15,000 American students demonstrated outside the White House against the bombing of North Vietnam.
If you let them live, they might love the Russians. Kill them, strafe them, gook creeps.
By the end of 1965, some 200,000 American combat troops were engaged in the fighting, and casualties were beginning to mount steadily. In a last effort to facilitate negotiation, President Johnson called a limited halt to the bombing over Christmas and the New Year. In the breathing space thus allowed, Americans once again began to debate the course upon which they had embarked. There was little agreement among the senators.
I believe the president should keep the lull in the bombing of North Vietnam going as long as he possibly can. I do not anticipate that we will have any reaction in the very near future, but I think this would be the best procedure to follow at this time, and I think it would be in support of the president's worldwide efforts to bring about some sort of an honorable settlement to the situation in Vietnam as a whole.
I don't think we should have ever stopped bombing. I think this was a tragic mistake. It may be a fatal mistake, but I hope not. You cannot trust the communists. Every time we sit down at a table with them, we get slapped in the face.
I think it would be a great mistake to escalate the war. I'm still hopeful that President Johnson's peace offensive will be successful. I think we need to give them lots and lots of time. We must be patient, not ordinarily much of an American virtue.
I think it's quite clear that this great country of ours has been flirting with tragedy for a good many months in Asia, and that the hands of the clock are indeed moving close to midnight.
As the bombing resumed once more, one of the most dramatic debates of our time was being staged in Washington. Under the chairmanship of Senator Fulbright, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee examined 6 witnesses as to the conduct, the aims, and the ethics of the war as it was being waged by the Johnson administration. One of the witnesses, George F. Kennan, gave his opinion as an expert on foreign affairs, as he was respectfully introduced by the chairman. Taking up the question as to whether the war could be won by America, Mr. Kennan had this to say.
There seems to be an impression about that if we bring sufficient military pressure to bear, there will occur at some point something in the nature of a political capitulation on the other side. I think this is a most dangerous assumption. I don't say that it's absolutely impossible, but it is a dangerous assumption in the light of the experience we've had with communist elements in the past. This is not the only reason why I think we should do everything possible to avoid the escalation of this conflict. There is another one, which is no less weighty, and this is the effect the conflict is already having on our policies and interests further afield. This involvement seems to me to represent a grievous misplacement of emphasis in our foreign policy as a whole. Our relations with the Soviet Union have suffered grievously, as was to be expected, and this at a time when far more important things were involved in those relations than what is ultimately involved in Vietnam, and when we had special reason, I think, to cultivate those relations. And more unfortunate still, in my opinion, is the damage being done to the feelings entertained for us by the Japanese people. The confidence and the good disposition of the Japanese is the greatest asset we have had and the greatest asset we could have in East Asia.
Most important witness at the hearings for the Johnson policy, perhaps, was the retired General Maxwell D. Taylor. The question of limited war, a war of containment rather than a war of escalation, had already been discussed more than once. General Taylor was against the concept.
To button up our troops in defensive positions and thus to sacrifice their unique attributes of mobility and firepower would constitute the abandonment of our lives on the battlefield and would assign a most inglorious mission to our troops, who for the present have high morale and complete confidence in their ability to cope with the Viet Cong in the field. The effect of such behavior on our Vietnamese allies could be disastrous. At a minimum, it would destroy all confidence in Vietnam and ultimate success, and would encourage the timid and the wavering to turn to the Viet Cong for protection and to the Liberation Front for political accommodation. Another serious result of such passivity would be the impossibility of obtaining honorable terms at any peace table. The communists are tough enough to deal with when one has the upper hand. They would never give us acceptable terms if the military situation reflected weakness on our part and a readiness to withdraw.
Under questioning by Senator Fulbright, the general denied that there was danger of an all-out offensive in Vietnam leading America on into war with China.
I certainly do not consider that our assistance to the very large Vietnamese force in South Vietnam, our support of this ally, constitutes the kind of war envisaged by that
Well, it's already been stated here, and I don't wish to repeat it, that it's contemplated by people in authority at least 600,000 men. And that I thought would be considered quite an involvement. But I think, General, in all honesty, that behind the concern of many of us is not just Vietnam, as much concerned as we are. I mean, it isn't, I don't mean it's insignificant, but is the possibility or even probability of this escalating into a war with China. And we always hesitate to talk about these things, but I'm sure that's one of my concerns. I would regret to see us continue this war to the point where we engaged in an all-out war with China. And many people that are wiser than I am believe this is a possibility.
As we discussed this morning, obviously one cannot rule it out. But I wonder whether our government or whether the Congress would suggest complete supineness on the part of our foreign policy in the Far East because of that relatively small possibility.
The general received his roughest treatment from Senator Wayne Morse, for whose anti-war attitude he had obviously little sympathy.
We're engaged in a historic debate in this country. We have honest differences of opinion. I happen to hold to the point of view that it isn't going to be too long before the American people, as a people, will repudiate our war in Southeast Asia.
That, of course, is good news to Hanoi, Senator.
I know that that's the smear artist that you militarists give to those of us that have honest differences of opinion with you, but I don't intend to get down in the gutter with you and engage in that kind of debate, General. I'm simply saying that in my judgment, the President of the United States is already losing the people of this country by the millions in connection with his war in Southeast Asia. And all I'm asking is, if the people decide that this war should be stopped in Southeast Asia, are you going to take the position that's weakness on the home front in a democracy?
I would feel that our people were badly misguided and did not understand the consequences of such a disaster.
Well, we agree on one thing, that they can be badly misguided, and you and the President, in my judgment, have been misguiding them for a long time in this war. Now, I take you...
Another clash between the General and Senator Morse occurred over the old question of how far escalation was likely to take America.
Well, one more question, if I may, General. Do you think that if we should get into a war with China, we could beat her by bombing either nuclear or conventional?
I beg your pardon?
If we should get into a war with Red China, God forbid, do you think we could beat her with bombing nuclear and conventional?
I wouldn't know what beat her means.
Force her to surrender.
I wouldn't know whether we'd want her to surrender or not. We could make her pay a tremendous price for her aggression.
Well, she doesn't have anything to fight back with except manpower. Wouldn't we have to meet her on the ground?
No, sir.
You would just meet her in the air.
To a large extent, we could, if
So
that's one way of doing it.
You take the position, this is very interesting, you take the position that if we get into a war with Red China, we're not going to have to send hundreds of thousands of men onto the mainland of China?
Not necessarily so.
Tell that to McNamara, so we can get you two together on the same advice.
One thing seems fairly probable. No other government in history has allowed its policy to be questioned so openly in time of war as did the Johnson administration during the Senate hearings in Washington. For it was surely a technicality that no war had ever been declared in Southeast Asia. The fact remained that the war was as bitter as any that America had ever fought, and as inhuman. If anything were needed to remind the world of its inhumanity, Senator Fulbright supplied it for the record. American jets had accidentally dropped 2 canisters of napalm on their own troops in battle.
The jellied gasoline burst into flames and set afire an estimated 40 to 50 of our soldiers. Safer, who was no more than 50 yards away from the scene, described the horrible sight. In a voice that almost broke under the emotional burden of his experience, the CBS correspondent said the American boys streamed out of the jungle, running like madmen, trying to get away from the jellied flames on their bodies, which was cooking them alive. One soldier, his hair and body on fire, ripped huge strips of his flesh off. Another, a medical corps man, cut large pieces of his burning flesh with his medical scissors, then dropped to the ground and died. Still another soldier, a fire on one side of his body from head to foot, raised his unburnt arm and shook his fist at the sky and the disappearing American plane, shouting, "USOBs, we're down here."
As another American pilot put it, on a luckier occasion,
I'm going to put a bomb on the target as I'm briefed to do, and I'm going to execute this mission, and I leave all my personal feelings out of the picture to do the job.
No wonder, perhaps, that U Thant should have threatened to refuse a second term of office, while such a war for any reason was being waged, in despite of the Charter of the United Nations.
In a statement today, the Secretary General referred to the conflict in Vietnam as, quote, one of the most barbarous wars in history. Today, it seems to me, he said, as it has seemed for many months, that the pressure of events is remorselessly leading toward a major war, while efforts to reverse that trend are lagging disastrously behind.
America has set her hopes upon the moon. But can she hope to enjoy the best of that or any other ideal while her feet suck down into the bottomless mud and blood of Southeast Asia? Some Americans believe that she can.
We can have both guns and butter. We had both guns and butter during World War II, when we had a general national mobilization. And we are even more productive now than we were then.
Perhaps neither guns nor butter is really enough for a country of America's traditions and idealism, for idealism is still very much a part of the American motivation. It was reflected again in a speech at Princeton by President Johnson.
Surely it is not a paranoid vision of America's place in the world to recognize that freedom is still indivisible, still has adversaries whose challenge must be answered. Today, of course, as we meet here, that challenge is sternest at the moment in Southeast Asia. Yet there, as elsewhere, our great power is also tempered by a great restraint. What nation has announced such limited objectives or such willingness to remove its military presence once those objectives are secured and achieved? What nation has spent the lives of its sons and vast sums of its fortune to provide the people of a small, striving country the chance to elect a course that we might not ourselves choose?
To set against that, here is an extract from another speech quoted shortly afterwards.
"The United States is in clear danger," he said, "of being left naked and alone in a hostile world. It is apparent only that American foreign policy has never in all its history suffered such a stunning reversal. What is American policy in Vietnam? All of us have listened to the dismal themes of reversals and confusions and alarms and excursions which have emerged from Washington. We have been caught bluffing by our enemies. Our friends and allies are frightened and wondering, as we do, where we are headed. The picture of a country needlessly weakened in the world today is so painful that we should turn our eyes from abroad and look homewards."
That also was said in a speech by Lyndon B. Johnson. But the speech was delivered in 1954, when he was still only Senate leader of the minority party. It was quoted by one of his former assistants, Mr. Richard N. Goodwin, at a lunch to Americans for Democratic Action. Mr. Goodwin concluded his own speech with these words: "It is not our privilege but our duty as patriots to write, to speak, to organize, to oppose any president and any party and any policy at any time which we believe threatens the grandeur of this nation and the well-being of its people. And this is such a time."
And with those contrasting views, we end this program, the last of these documentaries on American foreign policy. The recordings were of speeches and broadcasts made at the time. The narration was read by Edward Ward. The programs were written and produced for the BBC by D.G. Bridson.